So our next talk is by Katherine Morse, who is coming to us from California and Johns Hopkins and APL. And she's going to be talking about something about, superficially about as far from what we've just heard as possible, but which is critical to the translational aspect of the things that we're doing, which is how does one build standards that mean that the kind of modeling we're talking about potentially could be used in things like FDA approvals, clinical trials, and potentially also in the design of therapies. And so without more ado, I will turn it over to Katherine.
Okay, something's going on with my computer. It's being particularly slow today. So we'll just see if it'll cooperate in any useful sort of way. Okay, hopefully that works. Okay, first of all, James, thank you for both the invitation to speak and for that actually very helpful and precise introduction. So I do work for the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, but I'm going to talk to you today about my decades-long work with an organization called SISO, the Simulation Interoperability Standards Organization. I've held a number of leadership positions in this organization, including two very long, very successful terms as the chair of the Standards Activity Committee, which is responsible for the execution of SISO's primary mission, which is, not surprisingly, standards. I currently serve on the executive committee and the board of directors, and I am going to be talking today about standards and standards development. And as James pointed out, I think that this will be valuable information for you going forward as you start thinking about how might you build your own standards in a way that will help you to collaborate more as a community. So this is our SISO vision and mission statement. So our vision is that we're an organization dedicated to the promotion of modeling and simulation interoperability and reuse for the benefit of diverse M&S communities, including developers, procurers, and users worldwide. Now, if you've been engaged in SISO for many years, and I think probably John Rice is the only other person here to whom that might apply, you would see that we've done a lot of standards in the area of defense simulation, because that's where our roots are. But that's not all we do. And in fact, a number of the standards that we do, which I'm going to talk to you about today, are not focused on defense simulation, but more on simulation interoperability in general, because I will say over the course of my long and checkered career that people have come to me and said, well, we don't think what SISO does is going to be applicable to what we do because our modeling domain is very different. And so I will just say this up front. I recognize that your modeling domain is significantly different than my modeling domain, but the issues of simulation interoperability, in my experience, are always the same. So with that, our mission is to develop, maintain, manage, and promulgate user-driven, and that's very important, user-driven standards that improve the technical quality and cost efficiency of M&S implementations across the worldwide M&S community. And the user-driven is very important. I'll just say this. Every once in a while, someone will say to me, hey, SISO should develop the following standard because I think it's a good idea. SISO has exactly one employee, one. He's our executive director, and he's responsible for keeping the financial and sort of administrative mechanics of the organization working. But everything that we do as an organization to develop standards is done by the users or the volunteers, people like me, where we bring our own expertise. And so this is very much a forum to come together to develop various types of standards that meet your needs. And I will say, just shameless plug for SISO if you decide to do standards. We spent a lot of time working out the policies and procedures for developing standards and the infrastructure for doing that. And I'm here to tell you, having lived through the pain of most of that, that it's a great deal of work. And if you can avoid doing it yourself, I would. So that's my shameless plug for SISO. If you decide you need standards, please come see us first before you decide to do all that work yourself. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk a little bit about standards development, and then at the end, I'm going to talk about some standards which might already be applicable to where you might be going. Okay, so here's some personal axioms on standards. And so you see this little cabbage icon at the bottom. As John Rice will recall, years ago, I wrote this briefing called The Standards Cabbage Patch, Where Do Standards Come From? And it's sort of a tongue-in-cheek reflection on decades of developing standards. So it might not be 100% factual. It's definitely one woman's opinion, but there, I think, is a great deal of fundamental truth in here. So those axioms include the following: that standards are driven by the market, which is to say the buyers. And those standards free the buyers from being locked into a single vendor. And over time, this should have the effect of driving down prices in the market. So you can see how this works, in our day-to-day life, right? So IEEE maintains the 802.11 standard, which is the Wi-Fi standard. And if you buy that standard, you could start your own company, building wireless routers. It's not like somebody like Cisco could go, hey, nobody else can use this protocol. It's all us. You have to buy all your routers from us, right? So that's the benefit to the users. I maintain that all standards are fundamentally about interoperability, okay? Which is to say, if I want to pick up something and use it somewhere else, that's interoperability. Now, sometimes it's interoperability writ small, but it's interoperability nonetheless. So I made the next point a little bit on the last slide, which is standards development requires people. Like I said, SISO only has one employee. It requires people, and it requires committed people. Okay, so it's typical in standards development activities that you'll have a lot of people who participate just in sort of an observational role. That's not, I don't mean to discourage that, but if everyone's doing that, then there's no one doing the heavy lifting of actually doing work. Now, I'm leading an effort now, I'm going to talk about at the end, called the Cyber Data Exchange Model. There are a handful of us, about 10 or 15, and we're really doing the development. But there are a lot of other people engaged because they're paying attention, because they're planning to use the standard when they're done, and they're just watching. But if you're going to do standards, people have to commit their time to doing it. Absolutely, infrastructure and process are required, but they're not enough. We'll also say, and it's almost always the case, that standards aren't done. They need to evolve as technology and user requirements evolved. And if they're not evolving with those, with the technology and user requirements, then they need to go. The last one is kind of the more tongue-in-cheek perspective on this. Everyone wants an efficient, responsive standards process. Sure, we can all agree on that. Well, what they mean is it delivers the changes I want rapidly, and it never changes the things I don't want changed. So, gee, that would be swell. I will tell you, I'm in the simulation standards field, I'm very well known, but I've lost votes. Okay, there have been things I really wanted and I really lobbied for, and I lost the vote. Things happen, time to move on. So with that, what is a standard? So this one is also from the standards cabbage patch. There are things called de facto or in practice standards, and people use the term standard interchangeably sometimes, and because I do this a lot, it kind of makes me twitch, but sometimes people use it for technologies or protocols. And sometimes we refer to these as little s standards. So like, lowercase, not uppercase. So for example, I'm using PowerPoint. I think the last group will probably use PowerPoint. There are other tools, but mostly we all use PowerPoint. But that's not a standard because Microsoft controls it, right? So nobody gets to vote except Microsoft. So for those of you who are serious standards wonks, like I am, not really a standard. My preference is for de jure standards, which is by law standards, and those are developed by standards development bodies with legal and recognized standing. Oh, this says a representative list of such organizations is at the end of this briefing. I apologize, I should have taken that out. That slide's not in this briefing, but they're, some of their names, right? ISO, IEEE. I apologize, I don't know in your field who makes the standards, but, or who's the standards developing organization, but everybody who has standards has a standards developing organization. For people like me, for the high level architecture for modeling and simulation, that's IEEE. SISO is also a standards developing organization in its own right. So we develop IEEE standards, and we also develop SISO standards. Second shameless plug for SISO, unlike the IEEE, we give away our standards for free. Okay. So this is, with all that background, processes that generally apply in open standards development. And a lot of these are driven by antitrust laws, at least here in the US. So, you know, it sort of keeps you from developing a monopoly with respect to things. So A, an authoritative body establishes policies, procedures, and processes and ensures they are followed. Membership in the standards development process is not unduly restrictive, which is to say you can't go, oh, hey, if you want to vote, you have to pay $1 million. Voting rights are uniformly and fairly applied. At each stage of the development, members are allowed to comment and given sufficient time to do so. So sometimes people go, oh, I don't want to do a standard because it takes a long time. And I'll just say the following thing. I understand that. That is true, but it's not the entire truth. The problem is getting people to agree takes a long time. Okay, so if you care about people agreeing, it's going to take a while. I do some of this in the defense domain where we don't actually vote, but we still have to get everybody to agree. And by the way, those people are really, really set in their ways, and getting them to agree is very hard. And so the whole, you know, counting votes and making sure you wrote down exactly what your comment resolution was is not the problem. It's getting people to agree, and that takes time. Okay, consensus but not unanimity must be achieved, right? Like I said on the previous slide, or the one before that, I've lost votes. You know, I'm only one vote, so there's your voting rights uniformly and fairly applied. And you know, we didn't have unanimity. I voted no. It's, you know, I mean, I voted yes, and everybody else voted no, so I didn't get my way. It happens. Okay, the standard is made readily available, and so that's not like, oh yeah, we developed a standard, but nobody can see it. This might be with or without a license fee. You could see how an exorbitant license fee might qualify as not being readily available. So you have to be able to get the standard. And then there's periodic review and update performed to ensure continuing efficacy, easy for me to say, of standards. So you have to go back and look at the standard periodically. So here's a quick snapshot of what SISO standards development process looks like. And like I said, most of them look somewhat like this. There's an activity approval, so you do a product nomination. So a bunch of people who think that there's enough technical substance and enough existing consensus about something, do a product nomination, it gets approved. You start the process of developing the product, and so you have to draft the product. Now, most of these boxes, the size of these boxes are determined by the size of the font, but the amount of effort in these boxes is not reflected in the size of the boxes, because box 2 is the big one. That's where all the real work is. Then there are other mechanical processes like balloting. So you have to actually vote on the final thing and respond to comments. There's a product approval step, and you know, so this is part of the infrastructure of a standards development organization's process, where the processes of the organization have to check that you follow the process, that you know, so all those rules I just gave you about voting rights being uniformly applied and people adhering to the process, that's where this sort of thing gets checked to make sure that everybody who was a member got heard and didn't get shut down unfairly. And then in SISO, we have these things called product support groups. And this is the part where you go, okay, is the standard still relevant? People have questions, we need to answer their questions, and periodically go, oh, it's time to maybe look at revising the standard because technology has changed or user requirements have changed. So that's kind of SISO's process. But like I said, most standards development processes are something like this. Okay, so here's some SISO standards of potential interest. The first handful are about federation engineering, and just loosely that means you've got a bunch of simulations, and they probably weren't initially designed to work together, and now you've decided, hey, these 5 simulations, if we could bring them together, if we could make them talk together, we could build basically a larger simulation that would solve a bigger problem. I was talking to some folks the other day about the pandemic and, okay, but what other impacts are there? Like when people leave the hospital, but they're not entirely well, how do we see the epidemiology evolving based on their demographics and the kind of household they live in? Okay, so in order to do that, you need not just your epidemiology model, but you need your demographics model. And you probably also need something that represents pattern of life. So do those people, like, for example, I have the, I have the good fortune to be able to work here in my office at home, and I've been doing so for the last 14 months. I almost never interact with anybody except my husband. But, if I were in retail sales, I'd have to be in contact with people every day. That changes my risk factors. So that's the idea. We're bringing all these simulations together. So we've got 4 standards in this domain: the distributed simulation engineering and execution process, the Federation Engineering Agreements template, the simulation interoperability readiness levels, which is work in progress, and verification, validation, and accreditation. That's an overlay to that first standard. So those are all general purpose. So it doesn't matter what you're simulating, or maybe it's more appropriate to say, it doesn't matter what you're modeling. If you decide to bring your simulations together, these are going to help you identify and address issues that you're going to find. I'm going to talk a little bit about the HLA, which is actually the mechanism by which you might integrate things. And then I mentioned earlier, I might talk about the CyberDem. That's the cyber data exchange model. Clearly, the content of that is not relevant to what you're doing, but the process is valuable. So with that, so here's the DSEEP, and this is actually the peak of the Federation Engineering pyramid. And this is a generalized systems engineering process for building and executing distributed simulation applications. And distributed is really general in the sense. It could just be multiple simulations running on the same computer, but that aren't integrated into one monolithic piece of software. Because one of the challenges that people initially foresee when they talk about putting these simulations together is they say, oh, well, we're going to have to rewrite them all to talk to each other. Or, this one's in C++ and this one's in Java. How are we going to get them to talk to each other? So I'm going to talk about HLA in a minute, which is a standard that lets you put those things together. But this is about just bringing all those together. So this is basically a systems engineering process. It leads you through the stages of asking all the right questions at the right time. It gives you ideas about processes to perform, about documentation to develop. So, because remember, you're now getting out of the realm where a single person or a small core team of developers is working together. Now you've got a bigger group, and you've got to be more intentional about working together. So that's what this is. Systems engineering for your distributed simulations. Okay, so if we start up at the DSEEP, and now we're working down in more detail, one of the things that the DSEEP says is you're going to need Federation engineering agreements. And these are really specific things about how you're going to make things talk to each other, not the big things, the little things. So for example, hey, if you're doing faster than real-time simulation, right? And you've got to have some sort of discrete event simulation engine, and that discrete event simulation has to have a time scale. What's your time scale? You've got to agree about what that is. Things like that. If it matters how particular phenomena are modeled within individual simulations, then you've got to know that, because I'm going to come to VBNA in a minute, but you've got to know what those representations are. Even though they're in separate simulations, how those things are represented impact how relevant they are to other simulations. And so that's the kind of stuff you need to resolve as you're going through the DSEEP, and then the FEAT gives you a way to record those. It also is kind of a checklist. So you go, hey, does this thing apply to us? Are we going to have an issue with this? And if we are, we need to decide that. If we're not, we just check it off and go, okay, that doesn't matter to us. So for example, there's something in here called dead reckoning that you do with, things moving around and how fast they're moving and, where they're going to be in the future. It completely doesn't.
I apologize to break in, but just to give you your 5-minute warning.
Okay, I better speed up. So anyway, that's sort of the checklist. Okay, this is something we're working on right now, and this is about figuring out if you have enough documentation to figure out if you can put standards together. We do this all the time, and it's a huge mistake. We go, oh, this simulation does something I need, and this simulation does something I need. Let's put them together. Before we ever ask, is that going to work? Like, can we even put them together? How much work is it going to be to put them together? Are the results going to be valid? And we often charge into these things and don't ask those questions, and we get ourselves in a world of hurt. And so that's what this is about. Okay, so here's the HLA. And maybe in some ways, this is the most germane to what you might be doing next, which is to say, hey, we have these simulations. It seems like if we could just plug them together, if they could share results in real time. So instead of, I take your output file and I use it as input to my simulation, if we want to see how these things interact in real time, we need to actually have them communicate. So the HLA is a standard for simulation interoperability. It's a functional standard. And what that means is the standard itself says, if you go buy a piece of software that implements this standard, we call them a runtime infrastructure, or RTI. You can buy those commercially. There are a couple of open source ones. Here's what that infrastructure is going to do for you. So when you get to the part where you go, we need to get these things to talk to each other, I would ask that you go look at this first before you decide to build your own, because it took decades to get where we are on this. And there are a lot of subtleties of making these things work together properly that at first blush might seem like no big deal. Oh, hey, we just pass data back and forth, but there are actually quite a few intricacies to doing that. And I'm actually working on a project now where the project is using HLA, but they're using the 25-year-old version. And about once every 6 months, they discover some horrible problem that they're having to deal with, which we solved 20 years ago. And they go, but we don't want to change the version because we'll have to change the APIs. And it's like, well, okay, but there are all these problems we already solved. Maybe you should just use the new version. So, and I teach tutorials on this all the time. So if you get to the point where you decide, hey, we should make our simulations talk to each other, please call me up again and I'll be happy to explain this in detail. Okay, last slide. Cyber data exchange model. Once again, this standard itself is not relevant to what you're doing, but the process we're using is. And in fact, we had a meeting earlier today, and what we're doing is a data exchange model is a runtime data exchange model. So I said, HLA, you get things to talk to each other. One of the things you have to agree on to make that work is what data gets exchanged between your simulations and what's the actual representation of it. So what types of data are important? What are the semantics of that data? And what are the data types? And so what we did here was we got a bunch of people together who are working in the area and who are doing some amount of data exchange now. And we developed use cases. We said, okay, here's my use case. I need these kinds of simulations to communicate. They're representing this kind of attack. What kind of data needs to go into that? And we're in that process now. We did use cases. From that, we derived requirements. From that, we built our first draft. And now we're going back and revisiting that and going through the standards development process. We've submitted comments against that, and we're resolving those as a team. Once again, the sort of consensus but not unanimity process, and we'll refine our first draft based on that. And I expect sometime later this year, we'll get to balloting and we'll have a standard for this. But that's just, there are processes for doing these things. So, and I guess questions come up later. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much. I know that that's hard to, it's an enormous amount of material to present in a very short format, but I think you addressed a whole bunch of issues that we should be we need to be very aware of. Just to finish, before we start our discussion, we always appreciate your input and suggestions. Please let us know how we could do better on these meetings. We're always available to do that. And that then will be the end of the formal meeting. We have time for one General question before we open the breakout rooms. Is there one question to ask either of our speakers before we move to the open pit discussions? I actually have a general question about organization to our two speakers. Would you prefer to be put into breakout rooms to have separate discussions, or would you rather have a single forum where everyone talks at the same time?
Topics are pretty different.
Okay, so I'll create the breakout rooms then. All right. Is there one general question before we move to the breakout session?
If there's anybody who's going to one of the other breakout rooms who wants to ask a question of the other speaker first, that may be the precedence here for.
Am I audible? Sorry.
Please
am I
go
audible?
ahead. Yes,
Yeah.
go ahead.
So basically, I was just looking at some of the literature, and basically, I think the coronavirus, which the thing that makes it very special is the RNA polymerase that it carries, and that RNA polymerase with the double membrane structure, how it replicates in the lytic cycle, that particular mechanism could be useful. If we could study the people who has adverse effect to different drugs or therapies for standard with the standard therapies, that could tell us statistically what could be the key components which might be relevant for those adverse side effects. So probably that could help in standardization. It's just an open ended.
Does anybody want to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the drugs like remdesivir and other antiviral drugs are targeting that pathway. Obviously, that's not my expertise being in immunology, but I think that in some of the models that we've been working on, the viral replication pathway has been quite explicitly modeled. So I think that's definitely a good area of another area of investigation.